Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we'll be looking at the birth of Jacob and Esau in our continuing study of the book of Genesis. Genesis 25, verse 19. Now these are the records of the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. And we've seen that introduction a number of times in the book of Genesis. These are the records of the generations of, whether it's the heavens and the earth, or the generations of Adam, or the generations of Noah. Here it's the records of the generations of Isaac. And here it is. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean, that's where he was living in Aram, to be his wife. So we have this description of, setting forth of Isaac. He's 40 years old when he and Rebekah come together. And what we have, according to Kessler and Durlow, an outline that we've seen so far, taking us through Genesis. We began back in the early chapters of Genesis with a story of human origins. Mankind was created, but he fell into sin. He was driven out of the garden to the earth, which was subsequently cursed. Next, we saw the conflict between brothers, and we're going to see that brother conflict as a regular motif in the book of Genesis. But back there in the early chapters of Genesis, Cain murdered Abel, and eventually all mankind was destroyed except for Noah. But there's a continuing line that persists in the person of Noah. And then the pivotal point with Noah was where he forms a new people, and that new group of people, we see them going past the Tower of Babel, but it culminates in the family of Abraham. That becomes sort of the pivotal point in the book of Genesis. Next, we're going to see conflict again between brothers, really beginning in a sense between Ishmael and Isaac. And it wasn't so much the brothers; it was the mother, but also the brothers, as they're very young. And then that is echoed now in the story of Esau and Jacob. And that new line is going to persist in the sons of Jacob. But remember, there's going to be conflict between brothers even at the end of the book of Genesis. And finally, we'll have the story of Israel's origins. We started off with human origins. Now we come to Israel's origins as the brothers of Joseph sin against him, but at the end of the story, they are restored and brought into the, can I describe it this way, of the Garden of Egypt to escape the famine. And so we begin with a driven out of a garden, and we're going to end the story as they're going to return sort of to a garden, viewed that way. Genesis 25:21 then, Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife, this is Rebekah, because she was barren. Notice how we have a continuation of that barrenness motif that had been introduced when we first saw Abram and we were introduced to his wife Sarah. She was barren, and this is again the case with Rebekah. And so Isaac prays to the Lord because of Rebekah, and the Lord answered him, and Rebekah his wife conceived. Now notice this barren issue. He prays and she conceives, but when we take the chronology together, and we understand that these numbers are rounded off, either up or down, we're not sure exactly, but Isaac's age at his marriage is said to be 40 years old, and I take that in that neighborhood, and his age at the birth of Jacob and Esau is going to be 60. He'll be age 60. We'll see that in verse 26. We're not there yet. And that means he has gone 20 years, presumably, of praying for Rebekah before finally the Lord answers that prayer. Verse 22, but the children struggled together within her. And she said, if it is so, remember, she had waited for 20 years for these children, and now they're struggling. She says, if it is so, why am I this way? So she went to inquire of the Lord. It's something's wrong. There seems to be already in the womb a conflict going on. Verse 22, the Lord said to her, and she's given a prophecy, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples will be separated from your bodies, and one people shall be stronger than the other. Isn't that always the case when there's a conflict? There's usually one that's it's rarely that two people are evenly matched. But notice the significant thing at the end of this prophecy, and the older shall serve the younger. Now that went completely opposite to the way it normally was supposed to be in the ancient world. The older always was the ruling class, the leader of the family, the upper echelon, and yet here it's the older that is going to serve the younger. Now, what does this prophecy have to say about God's sovereignty versus the decisions that are going to be made during their lives by Jacob and by Esau? We're going to see them making real decisions that are going to impact their lives, and yet at the outset, before they've even done anything, while they are still in the womb, we read that the older will serve the younger. Walter Brueggemann, in his commentary on Genesis, he says that affirms that speaking of this question, he says, it affirms that we do not live in a world where all possibilities are kept open, and that we may choose our posture as we please. It doesn't deny freedom, but it requires us to speak also about destiny, about the working of this other one who will have a voice in the future. He goes on to say, there are some options that are closed and some choices denied this people of God. Jacob has some freedom. He can stay, he can go, he could fear, he can care, but all his freedom is bounded by the choices God has already made on his behalf. So the story of Jacob is outlined before us before it even takes place, and yet that does not excuse him or Esau. They make real decisions that have real impact, and yet God has traced the way that they're going to go. Genesis 25, verse 24, when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb, just as she had anticipated, just as it had been prophesied. Now the first came forth red, and the Hebrew word for red is admoni. And we're going to see where that sort of plays, it plays into the story, because Admoni, we're going to eventually see a country where Esau is going to end up, and it's going to be called Edom. And this is where that term comes from. We'll see a closer connection in a bit. He comes forth red all over like and here's the funny part, like a hairy garment. And the word hairy, se'ar, that you almost miss it. It's a little bit. Some of those letters are taken to form the word Esau. So there's a sense in which we could say, I mean, it's not exactly how you say it, but his name sort of sounds a little bit like, and is spelled a little bit like, Harry. So, what does Esau mean? Sort of, it sounds like the Hebrew word for Harry. And not, like sometimes we use Harry as a name today, Harry. Sort of like that maybe, but it's the idea. He comes out hairy, like a hairy garment, and so they name him that for that reason. Afterward, his brother came forth, and we're not told that he was called non-hairy, although that's going to be true. They're going to look very different. But afterward, his brother came forth with his hand holding on to Esau's heel. And the way you say heel in Hebrew is Akab. And so his name was called Jacob because that sounds a little bit like, Akab. In other words, they name him heel. Or we could say heel grabber. So his name was called Jacob. And that's a little play on the words because, when you say heel, back when I was a kid, they actually had this expression, you might call somebody a heel, and that was a derogatory term. You were saying he's not a very nice person. We have a similar expression in today's English. We say, he's pulling my leg. And by that we mean he's tricking me. He's trying to fool me. And that's more of the idea that this term had. When you healed somebody, when you heel grabbed somebody, you were deceiving them. And so Jacob is named heel grabber. And here's where we say Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to them. Now that same term, akav, heel, is found over in Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9. The heart is more deceitful, healed as it were, heel grabbered, than all else, and is desperately sick. Who can understand it? That's the term that's used. That's Jacob's name. And so he's named after this physical quality, but we're going to see in his life, the name is appropriate to some of the decisions he is going to make. Now, Romans chapter 9 gives us a New Testament commentary on these events. And in Romans chapter 9, Paul's approaching the question, why is it that there's so many people from Jewish people, and he is a Jewish person who believes in Jesus, but there's so many people from Israel, Jewish people, who have not believed in Jesus. And he says, look, it's not as though the word of God has failed, for they are not all Israel who were descended from Israel. And you say, how can that be? What do you mean, not all Israel is Israel? It's like saying not all light is light, not all blue is blue. Well, what he means by that, verse 7, nor are they all children because they are Abraham's descendants, but through Isaac your descendants will be named, even though a promise had been given to Abraham that your seed is going to be special and is going to be something special there, that doesn't necessarily apply to all of Abraham's descendants. He goes on to say in verse 8, that is, it is not the children of the flesh who are children of God, not the children of the flesh, but rather children of the promise are regarded as descendants. The promise of the seed, back that we saw throughout Genesis, is a special promise that's not just a fleshly thing, but there's a special line. He goes on to say, verse 9, for this is the word of promise, at this time I will come, and Sarah shall have a son. Verse 10, and not only this, but there was Rebekah also. That's the point that we just read. When she had conceived twins by one man, I mean, here's two boys, and they have the same mother, and they have the same father, our father Isaac. For though the twins were not yet born, and had not done anything good or bad, so that God's purpose, according to his choice, would stand, not because of works, but because of him who calls, it was said to her, the older will serve the younger. The point is that this was God's plan, not just because of what they would do, because they hadn't done anything yet, but so that God's plan and purpose would be carried out, not because of what they would do, although they would do some things, but because of God's calling and plan. The older would serve the younger. And then he quotes from another passage, also in the Old Testament, just as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. So that God's plan is going to be carried out, yes, through their decisions, their real actions. We don't want to say in spite of it, but as a part of that, God's overarching plan will be carried out. And that's good news for us, because we're also, if we've come to believe in Jesus, we're also part of his plan and program. And he's working something special in our life as well. And he began that. That plan was formed long before we were born. And indeed, there's a sense in which we became a part of that plan before the world was even created.